Good evening. My name is Michael Mercurio. I am the founding director of Cambridge Common Writers, an alumni association for the Leslie Low Res MFA in Creative Writing. I am no longer director. I stepped back a while ago, but I am happily still involved with Cambridge Common Writers in the role of hosting book launches for alums like ALISSA Butterworth. And so it's my pleasure to be here with you tonight. Just a little bit about Cambridge Common Writers. It is an independent literary organization dedicated to continuing the spirit that we all experienced during Leslie residencies. If you're not familiar with the low residency model, essentially what happens is people go to campus twice a year in January and June for 10 days at a time. Those 10 days are often described as being writer camp by those of us who are there. It's nonstop fun and excitement. It is seminars and readings and workshops and a lot of socializing, and we build really strong bonds in those times. So CCW exists to help keep fostering those bonds. And it is because of CCW tonight that we are able to hear ALISSA read from her debut novel, To Die is Different Than Supposed, which was published in February of 2025. I am going to give just a quick bio for ALISSA. Then what I'll do is hand things over to her because you all came to hear her. You didn't come to hear me. I get that. I'm excited to hear ALISSA read tonight and then have a little conversation with her afterwards. So, ALISSA Butterworth is an author, editor, certified book coach, and educator. She she lives in the Mid-Atlantic region with her family, which includes a silly rescue hound named Scout and a boisterous preschooler. ALISSA holds an MFA in fiction from Lesley University and a BA from Franklin and Marshall College. Her work, both prose and poetry, has appeared online and in print. ALISSA has appeared on television and the radio, and tonight here on Zoom, and has interned with both the Reading Eagle and Consequence magazine. Her short story concerning the death of Leighton Caulfield was named an honorable mention in the 11th annual NYC Midnight Short Story Contest. ALISSA was also a finalist in the 2019 NYC Midnight Flash Fiction Contest. ALISSA's short story, The Carriage Held But Just Ourselves, debuted as part of the Satellite Collective's Telephone International Art Exhibit in the spring of 2021, and the piece was published in the accompanying print anthology put out by Crosstown Press. Her newest contribution to the third telephone game is a short story entitled Girls Who See Gods, forthcoming in autumn 2025. I just want to say briefly that one of the things that ALISSA is clearly exceptional at is titling things. So if those titles don't make you want to go out and find all of those pieces, see me after class. We'll talk about it. So we're here tonight because ALISSA's debut literary novel, To Die is Different Than Supposed, was published last month through River Grove Books. She's now working on her first short story collection. Though her primary genre is fiction, she also works in poetry, journalism, creative nonfiction, and memoir, which we in the industry call a quadruple threat. She has taught creative writing to young teens and up through graduate students and runs a popular and long-standing writers' workshop. ALISSA is particularly interested in helping students discover or rediscover their own voices and gifts, and to help writers who have become stuck in their process. ALISSA is also a certified book coach in fiction through Author Accelerator. So please join me in giving a very warm welcome to ALISSA Butterworth. Sit back, relax. She's going to read for a bit, and then she and I will have a little chat afterwards. So, ALISSA, take it away.
Thank you, Michael. I feel like you made me sound a lot more exciting and prestigious than I am, so I appreciate that. And welcome to everybody. I see folks from my workshop. I see family members, friends. It's wonderful to have you all here. So I'm going to read actually the first chapter of the novel because I think it's a good place to start. So I'll go ahead and begin. Chapter 1, Ella, Monday, 3:30 a.m. Tonight I see the ghost again. I'm not expecting him. I never do. I dream that I'm awake, sitting up in bed, tied up in sheets in the duvet, my dream mouth caught me dry. I try to get the spit moving again, working my tongue against the top of my palate, my back pressed against the headboard, pulling my blankets up under my chin. Something moves around my bedroom. There are muffled sounds, strange variations in the dark that I strain my eyes to see. There's a soft whooshing going back and forth near the door. I'm hit with that dank wall of air you're met with when you're standing waiting on a subway platform and the train blazes by. It smells that way too, of the underside of Earth, tunnels long closed, thick and humid and uncomfortably warm, falling over my face like a damp towel. This should scare me, but it doesn't. The ghost takes a moment to form himself fully, which he lets me know he only ever does on my account. I wouldn't otherwise, he says, but if I did, I'd scare you so bad you'd die. His voice sounds like chirping birds. I look for him, his now familiar shape settling into itself as it has since I was little. I sense out ahead a set of shoulders, narrow and sloped, arms hanging down, blurring into the curtain of shadow that might pass for a lower body. Two dark, velvety wings arch out nobly from the ghost's back. You know I'm here, he says dejectedly. Why do you always doubt it at first? I lean back into the headboard, the dream, shrug my shoulders in the direction of him, a half apology for my disbelief. Well, anyway, he says, he's drawn himself together finely from the shadows he's made of. So well, I compliment him on his work. Thanks, he says, hugging his arms around himself in a way that feels distantly familiar, like I've seen someone from another life do the same thing. I've been sleeping in the middle of the bed. When I reach my hand out for the nightstand that's positioned on my right side, it's not quite there. On it is a lamp, two flashlights, and my cell phone, which also has a flashlight app if I wanted to use it. I don't like to be caught unprepared in the dark. No clock in my room, though. I don't like knowing how few hours are left until work in the morning. My hand gropes for a moment, fluttering like a nervous bird. It meets nothing but air. You need the lights? He asks, voice falling, hurt almost. I shrug again, not letting his dismay affect me. I'll give you dark, he suddenly booms, his words shaking my bed like the room's caught in an earthquake. His body loses form. He shoots as tall as the ceiling, arching his back, throwing his arms and wings out, becoming the blackest black he can muster. He eats all the light in the room. He's trying to scare me, but he's been doing this since I was 7. I know his tricks. It's a shame, I say, taking a deep breath. You look so solid and tidy until the goat lets out a howl that raises the hairs on the back of my neck, but I don't let on. The room is clammy and close. My ribs feel like they fit too tightly, like my heart will jackhammer its way right through. If you keep being nasty, I say louder, trying to not let him hear the involuntary hitch in my throat, I'll just wake up. He doesn't really scare me, but my body reacts to his smoke and mirrors anyway. He told me once that's normal, that people and ghosts aren't supposed to be in the same space, but he'd figured out a way around it. Then he'd smiled, his teeth a little crooked. He laughs hollowly, lets his eyes flare up a brilliant blue, striking against the darkness he's cut from. How do you know? He shouts right in my ear, that you're not awake already. I shrug. He doesn't consider that this is a problem I've already thought about. Each encounter between us, for him, seems somehow a reintroduction. But I remember his tendencies, his inclinations, what makes him shout or go silent. I know I'm asleep, that whatever he says is mostly bluster. Though he's never said it, he's not capable of hurting me, that he would never want to. We're in a stalemate, him bluffing and huge, me nonchalant on my bed with my arms tucked across my chest, playing comfortable and easy. I close my eyes, pretend that I'm asleep. You can't be asleep when you're already sleeping, he whines. I peek an eye open to see that he's coming back into himself, shadow compressing shadow until he's much the same as I've always known him. A solid form, dark as ink, with faintly burning blue eyes and wings that he tucks pertly against his back. He's about 5 feet tall when he's not throwing himself against the walls to scare me. Of course you're right, I say, patting the bed next to me, inviting him to come sit. He won't do it. The closest he'll get is perching on the foot of the bed, his legs hanging off the edge. Sometimes he kicks them back and forth as we talk, like a kid on a chair that's too tall for him. You should be afraid, Elle. I push my bottom lip out. Even though the room is dark, he perceives the slight. You should be, he tries again. You really should. Why? Something's coming, and it's big. He pauses for a moment, unsure in his words. It's big, and it will hurt you. I don't speak. Say you understand, he whispers urgently, that you'll be careful and that you'll watch. What? Please, doors have opened on their own. I don't know why. It's never happened like this before. Something's on its way, he tells me, his shadow body taut and shimmering. He's anxious, fluttery. I've never seen him act this way before. For the first time in his presence, I feel afraid. Not of him, but for him, for both of us. This talk of doors, he mentions them sometimes, but I never really understand it. What's coming is going to change everything, he says. I nod. I'll be careful. Don't worry about me. His blue eyes dim for a breath as he considers what I've said. Finally, he relaxes. He stretches his wings out, one after the other, and resettles them in a more comfortable position. He's discharged his message and is ready to move on to more palatable talk. Where's Owen? He asks, mischief tied up in his question, and maybe a bit of concern. My ghosts never liked Owen much. He should be happy. Owen's been gone a year now. Don't you know? Isn't that something you're kept up to date on? Yeah, he says, his eyes flaring brighter, blowtorch blue. But I guess I just wanted to make you say it. We talk, him laughing when I tell him the story of how my pants fell as I ran for the door of a restaurant on a rainy night. Oh, I saw that, he exclaims, sounding as much like a little boy as like a supernatural being, this bottom rung ghost or angel, whatever he is. He's funny, he's mercurial, and he loves to talk about action movies and sports and the lives of my three grown up brothers. He talks like he knows them, and in many ways he does. He's been coming to me in my sleep for as long as I can remember, nearly, and has asked about the boys from the start. Has anybody gotten fat? He asks, swinging his legs. Since when? Since ever. Well, sure, but they got taller too. This fascinates him, the idea that these boys that he's only ever heard about in my stories have become more than boys, are now grown men who live across the country, and that they rarely call each other or visit, as far as I know. How can you watch me but not them? I ask. How do you know about Owen and your pants? And my pants, but not the boys? His eyes dim. I can't see everything, he says. I can only go through some doors. Not all of them are open yet. And when you go through one, you forget some of what you knew before you did it. Doors? What can you see? You mostly, he answers, ignoring my question about the doors, and dumb stuff, like I can look out into outer space if I want. See stars no one living's ever seen before. That sounds amazing. Stars are just stars, he says simply, his eyes flaring up to blue again. I like people better. Your people I like best. How do I know you're real? I ask, a question I try to avoid, but often return to during our talks. How do I know that you're real? He says, teasing. I sigh, slide down the headboard so I'm lying on my back. My feet are down near his bottom where he's seated on the bed. I want to know suddenly what would happen if I kicked my foot out at him. Would it knock him off the bed or would it go right through him? Don't try it, he says crossly. I don't like being kicked any more than you do. How do you know what I was thinking? I can be in your head. How dumb are you? So you're just in my head then. Now you sound like that stupid doctor, he answers, frustrated. I remember the doctor, a thin man with a receding hairline, who had posters of kids in wheelchairs giving thumbs up hanging on his office walls. We had to go see him, my brothers and I, for a while after the accident. Jackson and I kept seeing him after the other two got to quit. I don't know what Jack ever talked about, but the doctor was interested in my dreams about the ghost who had started coming to see me. I didn't like him either, I say, and I won't kick you. Better not, or I'll throw you straight to hell. You'll burn up and then be brought back just so you can burn up again. You wouldn't. I would. I don't believe you. Well, he says, I guess I wouldn't, because you're interesting, and I take care of you. Is there hell anyway? Like a real one? You know, I can't talk about that, he says seriously, enunciating each word like I won't understand him otherwise. I only see what I see. I know, I say. I'm sorry I asked you. It's okay. Tell me about what Remy does for a job again. I lay on my back and he perches there on the end of the bed, and we talk. He wants to know everything from how awful my job as a substitute teacher is to stories he's heard for years and often asks me to repeat. Like what happened on one summer day many years ago when the boys went fishing and Adrian fell in the creek, what we all got for Christmas the year I was 5, what it was like when my parents first brought Remy home from the hospital. The stories are realer than real, he says, like things that happened to me. Thanks, I say. I guess I tell a good story. I guess, he says sadly. It's bluing out. I look to the window. He's right. Dawn's approach always signals the end of the dream. When I wake up in the real world and the ghost goes back to my imagination or heaven or wherever it is he spends his time. Please remember what I told you, he says urgently, even as the light coming in begins to fall on the floor just below his swinging shadow feet. Please be ready. Okay, I say, not sure what he's talking about, but wanting to be certain he's all right. This is how these nights always end now that I've gotten older, with me feeling a terrible maternal weight towards the ghost, hoping he'll be okay, that he'll find his way to where he's headed. When I was young, the nights often finished with him reassuring me. I shut my eyes against his leaving so I don't have to see him as he breaks apart. He told me to do this the first night he came. I haven't disobeyed him once. It'd be a terrible sight, his little boy form burning away like fog on a summer morning. It would be too much to stand. Why do you come to visit me? I ask, the same parting words I've always said. I come because you're afraid of the dark, he says faintly and from far away, like he's on the other end of a tin can telephone, and because you always left a copper. Will you come again? And there is no answer from him. I don't expect there to be. The real bluing dawn comes in through the gap in my curtains and wakes me soon enough. When it does, all trace of him is gone, except for the first time in my life, I'm left afraid after our parting. You never know what moments are prophetic and which mean nothing. No way to tell what's imperative, a warning, and what's somebody's dog barking in the night or the wind picking up the way it does in March. A rattled window pane can be so many things, a portent or a cold front coming through. So many nights my ghosts come and left as quick as a whisper, nothing but a sense of comfort and company in me when I wake. This morning there is the warning and the fear in his voice when he gave it.
That was marvelous. I told Alyssa when we were chatting before we started this event that I tore through her book because the fact is I kept wanting to find out what was going to happen next. A lot of it is because Alyssa, you set this up so beautifully with this first chapter. And I just want to say I was hooked because this is a ghost unlike any ghost I've encountered before in any of the stories that I can remember reading. And you bring this ghost into being in such a tangible way. Your attention to detail is so stunning. The way you describe the ghost, you know, I've never pictured a ghost with wings before, but this is a ghost with wings and a ghost with crooked teeth. I mean, these are the details that just really make it completely pop. So thank you for reading that opening for us and for giving folks who haven't yet had a chance to read the book a taste of it. I am going to put the link to get the book in the chat. So don't navigate away from this conversation. We haven't finished yet. But just to make sure, if you don't have a copy, you can get yourself a copy. You will want to read this book. So it is a book that tells the story of a family. It is a multi generational, multiple perspective kind of story. And as I was reading it, I was so struck by the way you were able to envision all of these individual characters with their inner lives and their individual pasts, and to bounce between them as you were telling the story. And I'm just wondering if you would mind talking a little bit about what it was like to write a book like this.
Certainly. It was difficult, I think, is the first thing I would say. I mean, for those who've kind of been on this journey with me, the book took over a decade, from
Mm,
when and that's like really when the origin of the story really was my thesis for my master's at Lesley, and it sort of spun out from there. And so navigating the different narrators, it was kind of interesting because it was a process of discovery, I think,
mm,
and each character really has a different story, even though they're all part of the same story. And so, what was both fun and difficult to manage, I think, is all those individual voices. I have a background in music, and so I always tend to talk in musical metaphors. And so, it's really, there's a lot of like polyphony within this, the multiple voices that work together. The other way I think of it is almost as like a mosaic,
Mm,
where the different voices together create a whole. I think if you pulled any one voice out, it maybe could stand alone, but I don't think that there would be the same power or resonance. Because to me, each character is an individual character with an individual trajectory, but the dialogue between them is just as important as their own individual path. And
yeah,
for people who've gotten to the end of the book, it's really about coming together and all of these fractured pieces and how they might create a different sort of whole. And so, writing from the perspective of five different characters, obviously, it took a lot. It was interesting though, because I didn't consciously set out to say, like, oh, this character talks in a certain vernacular, or this character always, I don't know what, references something or something like that. They really kind of developed organically on their own, with their own voices and their own interests and their own ways of looking at the world.
mm.
And so it was kind of cool to see the way that that developed. So I'm not sure if that answers your question. I feel like I'm speaking around it, but not quite getting to the heart.
No, no, you touched on all of it, and it raised a couple of other questions for me. Are there versions of this book, knowing that you must have written a ton over the past decade? Are there versions of this book where it was just from the perspective of one character? Was there a moment where you had kind of the aha, oh, I have to bring all of them into it?
So there was never a moment in which it was just one character. It was always about the group and about the family. And so what really actually had me sort of thinking about the question of, is there a dominant narrator or is this a collective, an ensemble cast, so to speak, was when I was starting to get ready to pitch the book and to kind of figure out, because when you pitch to an agent, you either um, you focus on one narrator, you focus on the group. And so it was kind of a slippery animal, like to nail down what the heart of the story was and whose story it was.
Yeah.
And so for a long time, I really felt like it was Jackson's story. And in some ways, it's still, he's sort of the key, the linchpin by the time you get to the end for folks who haven't finished or read the book. But as time went on, it was not just his story. It was, all of these other voices, his siblings matter just as much as he does. And when without, I felt all the voices, something was lost from the novel. There's a quote that I often think of from William Faulkner when he's talking about writing. I totally forgot, The Sun and the Fury.
Mm,
And so it's part of a series at the University of Virginia when he was giving interviews there. I believe he was the artist in residence in like 1959. So this is old stuff. But he said about that book, which is four different perspective characters. And so he said it started with an image of a little girl up a tree. And so the little girl up the tree in that story is named Caddy. And he imagined this image. And so he told the story from the perspective of one brother, and that wasn't enough. And so he told it from the next one, and the next one, and the next one. And that's almost the approach that I feel happened with this book for me, in that there was this story about this family and this loss and this tragedy and the series of tragedies, really. And I couldn't tell it from just one perspective because that wasn't the whole story. And then there was, I couldn't tell it from just two of them because it wasn't the whole story. And so it kind of went on like that. And then that's how I ended up with five perspective characters, which anybody who writes narrative, fiction or nonfiction, understands that that's a lot to manage. And I think that's partially why the book took as long as it did to really refine those voices. But I don't think that it would be the story that it is without all five of them.
yeah, I agree completely. And I am not surprised finding out that it took a decade's worth of work to get to where the book is. It is, again, a magnificent book. And I am so taken with so many of the characters. I felt as though I was moving among them. and really listening to them and getting to know them through the way you portray them. How did you have a system for keeping track of the different traits that you wanted to have or that emerged for these characters?
Um, Not a conscious system, I would
Okay.
say. The system that I had more had to do with keeping track of what was happening in the plot with which character, because of
Mm,
there's dual timelines within the story for anybody who hasn't read it. There's sort of the past story, it takes place about 20 years before the present, and there's the present story. And so in my apartment way back when I lived in Arlington, Massachusetts, all along the wall, it was probably 8 feet long. I had a timeline. I had sticky notes with each character's name, and they were above or below the storyline.
yeah.
And I have a picture of it, and I share it with my writing students sometimes because it goes to show, just how complicated this stuff can sometimes get. But I didn't have necessarily a lot of notes or anything regarding character traits. I always start stories generally, I feel like, with characters talking to me is the best way to describe it. And so I get to know them really well through that process. And so it just kind of fell out that different characters have different concerns and different approaches and voices. And so it wasn't something that I needed to work consciously to develop, but it
Hmm.
sort of came about anyway, which is interesting even to me as the writer.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm always interested in process and what systems writers devise to keep
Mm.
track of whatever they're working on. And your characters, I'm not surprised to find out that they speak directly to you because they really are fleshed out, three-dimensional, full characters. Um, I'm a poet. One of the major characters in the book is a poet. And I don't want to give spoilers because I want everyone to read the book. But I was joking before we started the recording that poets are often held on a pedestal in our culture. It's the, oh, this person is a poet, they're wise, they speak well, all of these things. But we're human, and the character in your book is so at times painfully human and so well rendered. And I just love that. you know I think there's a trend in some fiction today of writing these deeply likable characters because fiction is seen as an escape. This book is not, it's not just populated with likable characters, which isn't to say that I don't like the characters or that I don't want to spend more time with them, but it's like, I don't love all my friends all the time either. So, there's a real palpable sense of being among people. Um, and I just I want to understand, I guess, what is it that you when is it that you know that a character is working? How is it that you start writing these folks and then get them to a point where here they are and they feel like real people?
So for me, I think the answer to that question would be is when the character surprises me.
Mm,
And so what I mean by that is sometimes what happens when you write is, you're very prescriptive and you say, in this scene, this is going to happen. And you write it and it's a functional scene, but there's not like a certain spark or life to it.
yeah.
I find though that if I put characters in motion with each other in a scene and let that scene play out. When I say characters surprise me, I mean it literally. They say things that I'm surprised, conversations or scenes go in a different way because they react even differently than I had planned them to.
Yeah.
And so it's in those moments that I know that they're sort of stepping off the page.
Hmm.
They're becoming more than just somebody that, you close the book and that's the end of them.
Yeah. Do they ever visit you in dreams?
That's a good question. And I feel like I've had dreams about them, but I couldn't tell you what they were anymore. I think that's the nature though of working on any creative work, whether it's on short term or long term, is it's constantly working in your head, even when you're not. actively working on it. And so I am sure that I've had dreams about them.
Hmm. So I want to touch on speaking of dreams, the supernatural aspects of this novel, especially because you do something remarkable with them where they're supernatural aspects. But this novel is very grounded. It's very much set in a reality that we all would recognize, and so how did you how did you find the right pitch for that? How did you bring that in without turning it into a supernatural novel?
So in a lot of my work, I tend to, for some reason or another, use the speculative or the supernatural as a lens through which I can observe relationships or societal constructs um, in a different way. And so for
Hmm.
me, the supernatural element isn't something that's meant to scare as much as it is to give insight. Because even when if you look at something scary long enough, it starts to become something different. And so that's kind of the approach that I took. And for those who know me well, and I know I see some family members here, so you guys definitely know me well. I was always the kid who loved ghost stories. I would want to go on like those history ghost tours in any town that I visited. And so I kind of internalized a lot of these stories, these ghost stories, since I was a child. And the thing that always struck me about them is they're very much about people who are going through intense experiences. And so in my fiction, I like to explore that sort of other side of reality as a lens of focusing on what is here in our world. And so it's almost like a focusing agent for me,
Yeah.
which is why it's not, you know, smoke and mirrors and jump scares. Although I do enjoy that stuff. But
Oh,
especially in this novel, it's there is a ghost story at the heart of the story, but it's not a ghost story that I think people would commonly recognize as such.
yeah. There's not the sort of it, it's not the sort of cautionary tale of like the Marley Brothers in A Christmas Carol.
Yes.
It's very different from that, and there's a tenderness that you bring to the relationship between Ella and the ghost that I think speaks volumes and sets up nicely the approach that Ella brings throughout other parts of the book. I think that's one of my favorite things about it. She's such a great character, and I found myself being really taken with the fact that she's just so matter of fact about this ghost. That even though, in the chapter we heard, the ghost is giving her an ominous warning, and you know, she's unsettled by it, but she's still so matter of fact. She knows his tricks, and, he's been visiting her since she was a kid. So there's that familiarity there that really made it feel like family. And I loved that. It's so smartly wrought throughout the book. So, what are the unexpected challenges that you hit while writing this book that might surprise somebody who picks it up and sees this perfectly polished, beautiful piece of writing?
That's a good question. Um, I think just the amount of work that goes into getting a piece of writing from your first raw draft or your first 30 drafts or whatever it might be to what people hold in their hands.
Yeah.
I think just purely the going from, I'm sitting writing something by longhand or typing it into a Word doc to getting it to, a manuscript that you're ready to submit. And then from that point, taking the manuscript that you're ready to submit and then having it turn into a book.
Mm,
There's all of these steps I think that people just have no idea about.
yeah.
And so it's just all the work I think that goes into it and all the trial and error too. For every scene that stays in the book, in any book, there are multiple ways it could have gone.
Mm,
you know, and I always kind of describe the way that I write as two separate processes. Like drafting is very different than revising because
mm,
drafting is all about possibility. You know, the story can go out in any million of directions. And so for me, it's a very different way of approaching things to when I revise, which I say is a little more akin to like a process of discovery or mining. Like
mm,
you're going through and you're finding the thread and then you're following it and you're shaping. And so I think too, just folks I think don't realize sometimes that for all of the incarnations that a story could be, the one that you landed on might not even be the best one. That's
mm.
the other thing. This book, it's as far as I could take it, but I always am wondering, could I have done something differently? Should I have approached this differently? Um, so yeah, it's kind of like it's hard in a way to take a book and to say it's done now. And a story that I come back to, actually, the title is from Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. And by the time he died, he was working on either the sixth or the ninth edition of that book, depending on who counts the editions. And so I feel like that's a very good metaphor for what all writers go through. Even when you see your book, like you're holding it in your hands and it's finally here, you're also like, oh my gosh, should I have changed this? Should this chapter have fallen like earlier or later? And so all of that insecurity, I think, um, is something that people don't know about, but it's very real.
Yeah. Yeah. And thank you for being vulnerable enough to share that with us. I want to respond to it in two ways, and I have a question for you. Um, I want to say ZZ Packer, who is a celebrated writer, came and gave a reading at Leslie, and while she was on the podium reading from one of her books, she had a pencil in hand and was making edits. So, I think you are not alone in
Right.
that feeling. And Walt Whitman just kept tinkering forever
Yep.
with Leaves of Grass. He couldn't leave it alone.
Yep.
But I want to ask you what you like better, the drafting or the revising?
It when I'm drafting, I like that better, and when I'm revising, I like revising better, to be honest with you. Each has different highs and lows,
Okay.
and I have come to enjoy both because I feel that to be a successful writer, you have to be good at both. You have to show up on both sides of that process. Because there are a lot of people who have drafts and they sit in a drawer. There are a lot of people who spend a ton of time revising and don't ever know when to let the story go. And so I think you
Well,
have to be willing to go through both. And so for me, I have grown to enjoy both. I have grown to hate both.
it's very real. It's very, very real. Do you have any, knowing that some folks from your workshop are here tonight, do you have any tactics for either that you haven't shared with them or that you'd like to share with all of us?
Sure. So something that they have heard me say is the best writing advice that I didn't take was actually from my Leslie mentor, William Lychak, fantastic novelist if you haven't read his work. And so his admonition to me that I didn't take, and I should have because it probably would have shaved a significant amount of time off of that decade that I was telling you about, was to finish your first draft and then go back and polish.
Mm,
And so I was sort of a serial reviser of the first couple chapters. And so they were like brilliant. And then I didn't know where the story ended. And that was happening, I think, because I lacked uh, faith in my own ability to finish the story and to see where it goes. It's kind of this weird thing where you sit down and you suddenly realize you're writing a novel because it's like suddenly realizing that you were going to run a 5K, but it's actually a marathon. And it's you learn on the fly. And I was like I kept running my 5K instead of training for the entire thing.
mm-hmm.
And if I had listened to Bill, I do think the manuscript would have been done in a little bit of a shorter time period. So that is something I tell everybody is to finish your first draft. The other thing that I think, and I'm not sure if I've shared this with people as commonly, but the story in your head is never going to be as good as what's on the page. There's
Mm,
always a disconnect between what we dream and what we can produce. And that's just the way any art form, any creative outlet is like that. Any athlete will tell you that, any artist, any writer. And understanding that and sort of embracing the failure that is inherent in creating, I think gives an immense amount of freedom. There's a quote from John Steinbeck, which is in East of Eden. And so it's, let me see if I can remember it right. Now that we don't have to be perfect, we can be good. And that's a paraphrase, and it's not, that was not as eloquent as Steinbeck writes it. But I embrace that in my own work, and I encourage others to as well, because when you let go of the idea that what is in your head is going to match what comes out on the page, there's a lot of freedom, and you can get it pretty close. And so
Yeah.
I think those are the two things that I like to try to share with folks.
Yeah. And, I get the temptation to revise while you're writing because you're there. The work is there. You're looking at it.
Mhm.
You're going, oh, I should have used an M dash instead of a comma. Oh, there are too
For
many
sure.
adverbs. And it's so important to get it out in that iterative stage and not to overthink it. Because the minute you overthink it, you start to sink,
Yep.
and it becomes this morass that you'll never get out of. So
Hmm.
yeah. But I would imagine even if you had taken Bill's advice, that you still got to see a lot of really great scenery along the way.
Oh, for sure.
When you were running those consecutive 5Ks, however many of them turn into a marathon. I love that metaphor.
Yeah.
So yeah. Oh man, that really does speak to the way the writing process happens. And it's one of those things that I feel like nobody can really prepare you for it. You have to experience it for yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah. So, what's a question about this book that you've never been asked that you really want people to know the answer to?
That's a good question. Let me think a second.
Yeah,
If I knew
take
it,
your
I
time.
probably would have answered it. Um,
While you think, I'm going to once again put the link into the chat so that people can get this book.
right. So I have one, and I won't say that I haven't been asked it because I've been asked it sort of in a roundabout way.
Hmm.
But people, I think, would be curious why myself as a female writer chose to have four male narrators and one female narrator. And it's not that I don't like writing about women, and a lot of the work that I've written recently has female protagonists. But I think for me, the story really, the characters spoke to me as they are, and this is who they were. And so I wasn't really caught up in the fact that they were male versus female. They were Jackson and Ella and Adrian and Remy and Calvin, and that's just who they were. But I feel like that might be a question people would have, and I haven't answered.
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought that in because it's honestly not a question that I was thinking about. Again, because I was just so taken with these characters as people. I wasn't thinking like, oh, there's only one major female voice in the book
Hmm.
because she was, as I was reading it, the equal of all of the others. And, I never thought about it in any way other than the fact that, she had a lot of brothers. So it's that's interesting. But yeah, do you feel that your work is strongly informed by your experience as a woman in this world that is frankly not always terribly hospitable to women?
I think that it depends on the story that I'm working on.
Okay.
The story that you mentioned, Girls Who See God, is very much about the experience of women in this world from basically the 19th century on.
Mm,
It was a really fun piece to write. It's sort of a critique of social media, women's roles, brings in like 19th century women, female spiritualists, and all sorts of stuff. It's a little off the wall, but I really enjoyed writing it. I like you said, my writing, my characters come to me as they are, and so if they are a woman who is experiencing discrimination or hardship due to her gender, then that comes out in the work. But it's not necessarily the focus of what I do. I think for me, each story is different and has its own parameters and requirements. And so some of my work may be like that, and some of it is not. It's at the same time, all of your work is colored by your lens that you see the world through. And so you can't strip away the fact that, I am female. I live where I do. I grew up when I did. I have the family that I have. All those things play into it. But
Mhm.
at the same time, when you write fiction, especially, there's a certain way that you compartmentalize your own life when you explore the lives of your characters too.
Yeah. Yeah, I really appreciate hearing that. I'm working on a novel. It's the first one I've ever tried to write, and so I am learning a lot of this through trial and error, and it's really good to hear your approach to it. I mean, it's so smart and it makes so much sense. So what are you? What do you? I know you're working on a short story collection, but tell us a little bit about the short stories, if you can. Like, are there
Sure.
fabulous elements in them? Are any of them gritty cyberpunk stories? Yeah,
No gritty cyberpunk stories for me.
probably for the best.
Not so much. A lot of what I like to write, though, these days, and so some of the short stories have sort of a speculative bent.
Mm,
Usually, it's an exploration of maybe urban legends or ghosts or something in that realm. The story Girls Who See Gods, which will be coming out in, I think it's October of 2025 when the third telephone game premieres.
yeah,
Uh, has to do with the aurora borealis and all of the different ways that people have understood that, as well as 19th century teenage female spiritualists and mediums and all sorts of really interesting stuff. I love history too.
mm,
So I often have a historical element in what I'm writing, and I especially like to write short stories that involve some element of history in it, just
mm,
because I really like it a lot. So I think in the short story collection, you'll see some speculative pieces, some pieces that are a little more realistic, but historical. So little bits of historical fiction here or there. Some pieces
mm,
are flash, some pieces are longer. So it's kind of a mix of everything. And I have a body of work that I've built up. And so part of the process is kind of looking at everything that's there and saying, what is the theme between these
mm.
stories? What do I want to say with this collection?
Yeah,
And
yeah,
so it's finding that thread. And that's kind of the process I'm at now, where I'm reading through a lot of the work that I have. And some of it I'm like, whew, that doesn't fit, or why did I write that? But that's the fun of it too, is
yeah,
you throw some things out and you keep some things.
yeah. And I would imagine it also gives you an opportunity to revise some things that you haven't looked at in a while.
Or yeah. It's really interesting actually to go back and look at something that you wrote a few years ago, even and because you're a different person. Sometimes people come to me and they say, "Oh, I have a draft that I wrote in high school." And they're 35 years old and they want to get back to it. I'm like, well, you're not the same writer. So you at 15 versus you at 25 or 30 or whatever it is, we change, we season, we grow, our perspective shifts. And so I'm not the same writer I was when I wrote some of these pieces, which is actually really interesting because I sort of remember writing them, but they're from a slightly different lens.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I would hope we're all not the same people we were when we were 15. And as you were talking about incorporating history, I had the sad realization that you did incorporate history into To Die Is Different Than Supposed. It's just that it was 1995 as history, and I'm
Yeah,
not ready to admit that that's history.
not either.
That was my peak. Well, I guess. So, but it really speaks so strongly to your ability to manage history that I wasn't thinking of it as history, and you were able to so seamlessly move between the time periods. It never felt jolting to me, but they both felt so distinct. I knew I was in 1995 when I was in 1995, and I knew when I wasn't. And I feel like that's just gotten me even more excited for your short story collection. I want to see what you're going to be doing with that. Mm.
You'll
So,
probably enjoy the Girls Who See God story. I think it goes back to the earliest period is Neolithic, all
oh,
the way
oh,
through
yeah,
today. Yeah, I mean it's snippets, but it is long reaching. It's probably the largest timeline I've ever worked with.
yeah. Well, I love that you are ambitious enough to do that, that you're not scared off by that, and you're making it work. Yeah, I mean that's just so impressive to me. I wanted to just ask a little bit about telephone because I know about it, but
Sure,
I'm not
sure.
sure how many folks in the audience know what this telephone game is, and it's so cool. So, tell us a little bit about it and how you got involved with it.
Sure. So Telephone is a it's from a group called the Satellite Collective, and it is an arts game. It's international. And so the third game is currently running. So if anybody is a writer, an artist, and wants to apply, just search Telephone online. You'll find it. You can apply and hopefully play with us. And so what it is there's a message that starts, and it's just like that game that you played when you were a kid, where it's like whisper down the line. You start, and then by the end, it gets like sort of silly and misunderstood, and then everybody laughs. It's that same concept, but applied to art. And so the idea is that artists from around the world, not just writers, but visual artists, dancers, composers, filmmakers, sculptors, basically any art you could think of. And there's an initial message, and then it's given to all of these different artists. And so your role as an individual contributor is you're given this piece of art from someone else. And your role is to translate, is the word that they use for it, translate the message that you're getting from it. So that's sort of whispered down the alley.
Mm,
And then your piece goes on to another artist somewhere else in the world. And so it's really interesting because it transcends language, it transcends gender, age, location. I mean, there are folks playing literally from all over the world, sometimes in war-torn areas.
mm,
And so I've found it to be an incredibly invigorating experience. And so I've played twice. There was the first incarnation of it that I don't even remember how I found out about it. I think another artist that I know
mm,
participated and was like, there was a call for people to apply. And so I did. And the first game was bigger, was smaller. And then the second game is a little bigger. And the third game is massive, thousands of artists from across the world. And so the game goes on for almost a year.
mm,
And so then all of the art, and by art again, I mean all of the different pieces that are created are put online, and so you can actually follow these these links, these threads,
mm.
and see how the message changes, which is really really cool. And so it's been a real privilege to play both times. And I feel like I've created some really interesting art based on it that I never would have otherwise. Both times I ended up being given visual art. And then I think the next time my story was translated into a painting, which was really, really cool. I mean, to see a piece of your work as a writer then suddenly like interpreted in a totally different art form is quite an experience that I don't think most of us get to have. And so it's really cool, and everybody should check it out. You can find the first and second game online now that was published previously, and then I think it's October 2025 is the goal for Telephone Game 3 to go live online.
Mm.
And so the goal then is to just have it online as long as it'll go. So it's this international art exhibit. It's really cool.
Yeah, I love that, and I found out about it through one of the Leslie mentors, Pam Petro, um,
Okay.
and
I
I
might
did
have found
not.
out it through Pam too, actually, I want to say.
Yeah, and Pam's really good at helping get stuff out there and building
She
communities.
is.
So, but I'm so excited to go and look and see not only your pieces but the pieces that they inspired as well. I popped the link to the telephone website in the chat, so folks who are not familiar with it can grab it there and go take a look. We've got a couple of minutes left. I wanted to see if you wanted to take a question from the audience,
Sure, we
or
can do that.
okay. If anyone has a question that they would like to put to Alyssa, please feel free to either raise your hand in the little Zoom hand raise feature or pop it in the chat and I will be happy to read it out. Oh, Jennifer just said that she's looking forward to reading the book, and the first chapter intrigued her. And you are in for a ride, Jennifer, and everyone else. You are going to really enjoy this book. I want to just ask one final question, Alyssa.
Yeah, go for it.
Where can people see you and get their books signed? Are you doing any kind of a tour or?
So I am currently in the very early stages of figuring out what a book tour will look like. I hope
Okay.
to do a few appearances down where I live in Pennsylvania, and then I'm also hoping to go back up to New England. Um, so I moved from Massachusetts last year,
Mhm.
so I haven't spent as much time up there as I wish I could, and so I'm hoping to set up a couple of get-togethers, appearances. Otherwise, the best place to find me is my website, which is just alissabutterworth.com. Um, yeah, I think that's really the best way to find me right now. I have an events section on my website, so I'll put anything that I schedule up there.
Right? I'm putting your website in the chat. I mean, I had also used it for the link for where people can find the book. Um, Mary says, massive congrats, Alyssa. Love the first chapter you finally settled on. It's perfect.
So
And
can I just respond to Mary?
absolutely, this is your reading.
So so what I will say is Mary is a fantastic book coach. And when I was going through my certification program, which Mary also is certified through, I actually worked with her as a book coach and getting my manuscript ready to pitch to agents. And so Mary actually suggested that I switch the ghost chapter to the first chapter. I had previously had a different one there. And so I feel like the book really blossomed because of Mary's advice. So I just wanted to like draw attention to her and her fantastic instinct as far as this book was concerned. It would not be where it is in publication without her. She's also joining us from the UK, which is fantastic. It must be the middle of the night there.
Ah,
But I'm so happy to see you, Mary. And I just want to say thank you again for your help because you really did help me when I needed a push with this book to really get it, sort of that over that last hurdle.
I'm going to take the spotlights off so that we can all see. Mary is holding up a copy of the book. Thank you, Mary, and thank you for being here at what, 4 a.m. your time? Okay.
It's about midnight. It's not that bad.
I'm not good at math. So, well, still very, very glad that you are here with us. Glad that you have all been here with us tonight for this incredible reading, this great conversation. Um, Lori says, thank you for your exceptional book. Rebecca says, thanks for the reading. This has been such a pleasure, Alyssa. I cannot wait for your short stories. I cannot wait for your next novel. I'm so glad to be connected with you through Cambridge Common Writers. And I'm glad that we were able to feature your book and help launch it into the world tonight. I will be looking for any events in the New England area so that I can come and get a copy of the book signed for myself. And I encourage you all to do the same. So thank you all, and we'll see you next time.